Kevin, can you tell me something about the evidence for graveyards at the sites of residential schools, former residential schools?
Well, at this point, there's three kinds of evidence. There's a lot of eyewitness accounts, which I've documented over about 15 years, pointing to graves often on the grounds of the former school or an Indian hospital nearby, like the Nanaimo Indian Hospital here in Nanaimo. Second is documentation, where we found letters referring to these grave sites from Indian agents, school officials, other people. And finally, in a place like Port Alberni, we've actually gone out with a forensic team and done a survey of the ground. And they found that some of the people 3 years ago that did this survey found terrain very similar to what you find in mass grave sites in other parts of the world, like sinkholes and the vegetation and that. So there's pretty conclusive evidence that these kids are buried somewhere around there. Also, the very high death rate level, which the government's already acknowledged, was around 50%. The question is, where are all those bodies? You know, what happened to all those kids? So all of that together suggests that, yes, there's a lot of unmarked graves in Canada of these kids.
And these might be children who died of things like tuberculosis, as well as from violence?
All of the above. From what I can figure out so far, the most common cause of death was rampant disease, which was deliberately introduced. We had that from doctors like Peter Bryce, who saw that happening, saw children who were healthy being deliberately housed with those sick. We have eyewitnesses describing that to them. TB and smallpox, the primary cause of death. So not accidental, definitely intentional. But also just the whole reign of terror and the beatings, the killings that happened, all of that. It was multiple homicides, really.
You have plans for forensic examinations of these sites?
Well, the plans would have to come from two sources. It would have to come from the Native people themselves, who would have to make the decision to take that step and to bring back their relatives who died in these places. The second would be from international bodies that would be invited in to help them with that. So, for example, forensic examination teams from Europe are actually standing by to get the okay from those native groups if they're willing to do that. The big impediment so far has been either indifference or direct threats from the Canadian government and the RCMP that that kind of thing would not be tolerated.
What is the evidence for possible grave sites here in Nanaimo?
Well, in Nanaimo, the main site that we know of is at the former Nanaimo Indian Hospital, which is in the barracks, or the former barracks, that are immediately south of Vancouver Island University. On military land, we have numerous eyewitnesses who describe, including one woman who actually saw burials happening behind the huts. There was a whole series of medical experimentations, sterilization programs, and other things going on in that hospital from about the 1930s, at least up to 1969, and possibly into the 1970s in those places. And I mean, that's the major one we know about around here. Of course, Cooper Island, Port Alberni, there's numerous sites on Vancouver Island as well.
And elsewhere in Canada?
We've traced 28 suspected sites, mostly in Western Canada, which is where most of the schools were. But some, for example, the oldest residential school in Canada in Brantford, Ontario, the Anglican school there, the Mohawk School it was called. If you look out, and I gave a lecture there a couple of years ago, when you look out back, there's rows and rows of trees, and Native people there say that beneath every tree is there buried a child, because they used to do that whenever the kids died. They buried trees on top of them, probably so they could never be disinterred. So I mean, you get these stories all over the country.